Okay, so today's lecture will be on movements and how the brain controls movements. And I know some of you may have had some of the introductory courses where we more extensively talk about movements and the brain, but this talk will be an overview on how the brain controls movements, and I will go into certain examples on how you, for instance, make grasping movements, but otherwise it will be an overview describing the different parts of the brain that are involved in motor control and control of movements. And the whole issue of motor control is sort of an issue which is should be understood more or less like the problem of the hen and the egg, because movements is always very intimately linked to the sensory input that the body receives. But on the other hand, again, whenever you produce a movement, you also change the environment, which means that it's not like you always respond to something from the external world and react to that, but you also have inner desires to achieve certain goals, which will change the way that you move. So it's always this interaction between the sensory input that you have from the external world and your inner desires to actually achieve certain goals. So speaking also about where in the brain that movements they originate, and speak about one place that's sort of the origin of a movement is something which is very hard to actually do, because we always received a lot of sensory input that we respond to, and we always have these inner desires. We are hungry, we need something to drink, which will change the way that we behave. So a lot of us have a basic idea that reflexes, they are sort of this very mechanistic mechanism in the spinal cord, where you just tap somewhere and you will see a jerk of a limb, and that's certainly one way of understanding movements. However, as I will show you, there is ways that the brain can always try and interact with these even basic reflexes and change them slightly, and that's one way of looking at the movement, so that we have these basic reflexes that can actually be modulated at very different levels of the brain. So another issue is, of course, also to understand, so why is it that we actually want to have this piece of pie? There can be many reasons why we want to take this piece of pie. Maybe we think it's delicious and we want something sweet to eat. It could also be that we want to be very kind to our grandmothers and please her. And these are also issues that you can deal with in motor control, so why you actually try and do a certain movement. However, it's quite difficult to actually pinpoint out where it's this origin to actually do the movement. So rather, I actually prefer more to look at it in a way that's described sort of in Leo Tolstoy's book War and Peace, so that there is no really single point in which Napoleon he decides to, when we look at his invasion of Russia, there is no real single point where he sort of makes the decision to, now I want to invade Russia. It's a lot of small events that happens, which actually in the end leads to his invasion of Russia. But and the same way, I think we should try and understand movement. So it's all these small bits and pieces that's put together, and that makes up the final movements that we actually do. So last time we looked a little on some of the ascending pathways, or 2 times ago, where on how the central nervous systems receive input from the periphery. So we receive touch and proprioception through the spinal cord, which is then going through the spinal cord up to the medulla and midbrain, and from the thalamus up to the primary somatosensory cortices. So that's one direction that we have to look at, this interaction between the sensory and the motor system. On the other hand, we have the descending pathway going from the primary motor cortex through the midbrain and again through the pons medulla, and then crossing over the midline, going down to ventral horn of the spinal cord leading to movement. So we have this pathway from the primary motor cortex going downwards. And we should understand this interaction as something that continuously is happening, so that we all the time receive sensory input, and we all the time also send motor commands down to our muscles in order to produce movements. So we have the corticospinal tract, which is the major pathway from the primary motor cortex, leading through the midbrain and the pons down to the primary, or to the spinal cord. And even in there are different pathways within the corticospinal tract. So there is at least from the primary motor cortex, but also from the premotor cortex, there are direct projections to the corticospinal tract. And over here we can see how the corticospinal tract then runs down here in and then ends up in the motor neurons in the ventral horn that then can be send commands, motor commands to the muscles. However, there is also this everlasting influence from other regions of the brain. So there will always be also regions such as the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, which slightly modulates the output from the primary motor cortex. And in the end, I will show you some examples on how this is done. But in the end, it leads to the fact that we have these motor neurons in the ventral horn that leads to movements. So that's sort of the primary pathway that's important to understand. So going from the motor areas of the brain through the spinal cord and down to the motor neurons.